with my not coming and understanding it and so on. It was really crucial for me that I could do it. All right, just to find what I shall share. Share the screen. Okay. Can you still hear me? Okay. But you can't see my screen yet, I suppose.
No.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Let's do it again. Okay, we'll fix it. Do not worry. I cannot choose the presentation. I will open it again. Okay. Okay. Is it working now? Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, it works. Great.
Okay, thank you so much. If it doesn't, because now I see just my presentation and I cannot see you. It's a kind of bizarre experience. So if something is not working, please do interrupt me. I really appreciate the presentation also of my work. I always feel a little bit embarrassed. I'm happy that you know about my work from this presentation of DICLIT. I'm just showing it on the screen. These are recent things in English. Of course, I partially also write in Polish. So this conference, which I couldn't attend, was of special importance for me, not only because of the topic and the place and your kind invitation to have me as a keynote, but also that it was giving us this point of view from Central, let's say, and Eastern Europe, so that we were not so much Western centered. And in my talk today, I will be a bit centered because I want you to give you some introductory remark in a sense, or a list of snapshot. What does it mean to intervene from feminist point of view into science? Or how do I understand what is feminist intervention in feminist science and technology studies, or feminist philosophy of science? I would call myself philosopher of science, but recently I mainly work in feminist science and technology studies, so much broader scope, let's say. And I will start from some general remarks, and then I will go to some examples, which I think will be particular enough to understand what this intervention can mean. But I would like to apologize everyone who is very familiar with the topic, so that some of my points will be too general, but I'm assuming that maybe some of you are just starting your intellectual adventure with feminist philosophy of science. So Dietrich already mentioned Haraway's work, and I will use Haraway also in my presentation today for a while later on. But I would like to start from the question which was asked by Londa Schiebinger, whose work you have on the screen, when she asked, has feminism changed science? She did it both in one of her articles, but also in her book. And it was after quite a many years of feminist movement and also of feminist theories, including feminist thought in epistemology and philosophy of science. She was asking very concrete questions. have a chance to observe some changes in science itself as a research area, but also in philosophy of science or science and technology studies. Londa Schiebinger, she's an American historian of science, but also philosopher. And I will also give you some hints to her collaborative work, giving the examples how can we use feminist criticism to do better science. As you can see on the screen, she was asking if feminist theories played any role in creating some links about traditionally understood social sciences and humanities on the one hand, and on the other, science understood as a kind of essence of doing especially experimental science. Of course, we know that in English-speaking countries, science means something else than in German, at least historically. It's difficult to say if it does in globalized science today, which has to be written in English and so on. But this is another question. What she was doing was that if we can find any usage of the tradition, which initially is socio-political tradition, resulting in some theories into the practice, which is basically understood as aiming at objective knowledge. And I will go back to it in a minute. Very primarily thing which we can say about feminist approach in feminist studies or feminist or science and technology studies is that it looks at certain parts of the scientific research. That what is called in the tradition of philosophy of science gender problem in science, and of course it is coming from a critical approach to scientific research. And we can look at scientific activities through language, visual representations, and show how they have power to shape scientific practice, including questions particular disciplines are asking, results which are obtained in those uh, disciplines, and what kind of interpretations are given there. So to speak, when we look at the way how feminist scholars dealing with science understand the intervention, it can be understood on that level as well, that we are analyzing language and choice of words, metaphors, concepts, and so on, which seems to me very philosophical work. So that would be kind of methodological level of doing that kind of research. Another, let's say, dimension of this feminist approach to scientific research is a kind of reorientation of values or directions within philosophy of science. And feminist philosophy of science is a kind of I would say, very well embedded tradition already. But when Janet Kurani was writing her book and also her article asking what kind of philosophy of science we are needing or we need in the 20th century, she was pointing out that somehow we will be changing our directions. So her point was that in line with traditional cognitive values and classical epistemic values, which were always valid and important for philosophy of science, we will be also introducing and treating even as more important those approaches for which such values like equality, pluralism, inclusion, democratization, and progress will be in the same way important for our studies. So what she's doing in that book is that she's trying to point out that it is not enough if science is following traditional values like aiming at truth, like using certain methodologies which are valuable, which are also comprehensible, and so on. And we can enumerate a lot of criteria for them. But scientific research should also aim at something which she calls egalitarian way of doing science. And for traditional philosophy of science, it would be situated within the context which is of no interest. So in a way, this feminist approach is reorientating this traditional direction in philosophy of science. It's another topic to be discussed on, and as it started Haraway's discussion on how we should understand objectivity, for example, from that point of view, is a huge topic, and there are a lot of different currents and views on that, including ones which are reconsidering the very concept of objectivity. But I would just like to underline that if we are doing feminist philosophy of science, we are already within the scope of non-traditional approach to scientific research. I've already mentioned the idea that, and I wanted to point it out in the title of my speech or talk, that feminist thinking can be understood as an approach who is trying to combine those two traditions in thinking about knowledge, something which is called also two cultures, so that we have critical social theories which are far more, let's say, ideologically involved, and they have a lot in common with political approach on the one hand, and humanities and social sciences are within that scope. And on the other hand, we have science, which is doing experimental work and is far away from any, or should be far away from anything which we could call somehow involved politically or ideologically. So in some cases, this feminist intervention can be understood as an attempt to build a kind of link between those two cultures, which, according to such thinking like Bruno Latour, we have as a heritage from modern science. Again, it's another topic. So just to put it more plainly, feminism is almost always very easily connected with ideologically involved approach of the social or political character. Whereas in those traditions which are dealing more with philosophy of science and traditions I am interested in, and I will give you some examples in a minute, feminists can be considered as a set of theories which also are talking about subjectivity, cognition, consciousness, and so on. So it's not only about social relations, it's not only ideologically involved, resulting in some political issues and so on. Of course, it is politically involved for many different good reasons, but it should not be equated with something which is just ideology. So, as an example, we can start from, maybe it is known for you, there is a certain tradition of cognitive science which is called embodied mind or embodied cognition, and we can see that feminist approach can be treated and is treated, and there are a lot of thinkers who are trying to interpret it in such a way that it can be understood as a theory of embodied and situated cognition as itself, so that feminist is not situated just on one of the side of these two cultures perspective, so to speak. One of the reasons why feminist philosophy of science could be on that kind is, I think, in a way, accidental. And I'm just explaining what I mean. I'm presenting you some books which were written by feminists who were politically involved in feminist movement, but they were scientists themselves, mainly biologists. And I'm presenting biologists because I was dealing with biology with my in my books mainly, so it's easy for me to do. What I want to point out, and it includes also Donna Haraway, who was educated in molecular biology, that when you were doing science together with critical feminist approach, it resulted in certain view of how philosophy of science or science and technology studies should be done, so that it could improve your scientific research and could change and reorient the way we do science or we do philosophy of science till now. And I will go to some snapshot of examples how we can understand this feminist intervention. Of course, I will just leave behind me a lot of controversies within such an approach in philosophy of science and such an approach to science itself. We can go back to it in the question if you like. So one of the scholars who was at the same time scientist and feminist thinker is Evelyn Fox Keller. She's a physicist, and she has written two quite famous books. One was the collection of essays, Reflection on Gender and Science, where she's trying to convince us that feminist approach can be seen as a point of contact between cultural intuitions, spiritual elements, and experimental sciences. So in her own words, she's trying to point out that we can combine these two cultures again. And these two cultures traditionally were dealing with, on the one hand, something we call culture or even spiritual life, and this is the domain of social sciences and humanities. And on the other hand, we have nature, with which biology, chemistry, physics, and so on is dealing with. And she, as a physicist, trained and dealing with physics as a serious scholar, is trying to show that for her, it is not something which cannot be treated as complementary. So she thinks that this feminist approach, which is important on this both sides, can give us more complementary knowledge. One of her famous historical books was a book devoted to life and work of Barbara McClintock. She is a Nobel Prize winner scholar working in molecular biology. And what Evelyn Fox Keller is trying to show us is that she can write about this very important scientist from also feminist point of view, and it does not mean that it will not be having this cognitive dimension, so that these feminist theories can introduce this link between science studies and political subjectivity, which is not separated from this cognitive dimension, as I say on the screen. And if you look at the title of her book, it is not accidental that she says that this famous biologist, molecular biologist, Nobel Prize winner, is saying about feeling for the organism. And she's explaining why she's using that vocabulary and why this vocabulary is not only more connected with femininity, with affective life, which is not easily seen within the scope of scientific approach, but also that it has this cognitive dimension, that it changed her approach in biology itself, that it was not, or let me put it this way, that it was very important for her that through that feeling, she was describing her priorities, which ended in discoveries for a Nobel Prize winner. So what I want to say that Fox Keller is an example of a scholar who is combining, on the one hand, the outcome of experimental work with very nuanced interpretation of narratives and metaphors which play a certain role in biology. And for both of them, she is giving a cognitive dimension. I told you that I will go back to Donna Haraway as well. And in her interpretation of certain domains in science, she also is pointing out how we should understand such domain as biology, or particularly in this article I'm showing on the slide, primatology, which she calls is that it's a politics by other means. So even in the title, she's pointing out how certain domain of scientific research can be understood also through political notions, and what is that political dimension in the scientific research, and how it changes priorities, how it changes the way it is done, successfully or not. And primatology is a very informative example, because historically speaking, we can show that whereas the lot of scholars in primatology who were very deeply involved in feminist movement, and they were also feministically oriented, but they were distancing themselves from association with feminism. Linda Murray Fadigan, one of the quite famous primatologist, she's explaining herself in the article The Paradox of Feminist Primatology, because she knows that also herself. She was afraid that if primatology will be more connected with feminism, she will be devaluated in a certain way as an ideologically involved discipline. So she says that as primatologists, they were distancing themselves from anything which could be called political, because they wanted to be seen as full-blooded scholars who are working within this scientific credo of objectivity. That way, she was keeping the idealistic view of science. So I was once upon a time, I was more involved in analyzing the discourses of primatology. I'm not sure if it is still the case, but even if certain scholars have feminist views, and they also have feminist views who have a certain impact on their own work, it's not so easy to talk about it in an open way. And it's obvious because the tradition of doing valid science is within the objectivity scope, which also shows why this discussion about objectivity and how we should understand it, coming from Haraway, but also from Kurani, about whom I was speaking about, is so important within philosophy of science today, not only feminist philosophy of science. In the tradition of feminist science and technology studies, we can see certain ways which it is done. So these thinkers would like to increase gender awareness or gender sensitivity in science practitioners. So not only to point out how on the level of institution the gender distribution is working, but also how it influences certain statements within certain disciplines. And it can be easily done in biology. As I already pointed out in primatology, I will give you some hints also to neurology or neuroscience. So on the one hand, it is true that the dynamics of feminist thinking is dealing with the role of women within science, also asking sometimes questions which are philosophically quite controversial. Is there's something like female or male science. What does it mean in this case, if we can really describe it in such a way, comparing it to a neutral way of seeing science. But on the level which is of far more interesting for me is that we are checking out how gender dimension is influencing the priorities of certain discipline, the way the questions are asked there, the way we are financing certain trends in the disciplines of particular research, and so on and so forth. And I will finish my presentation with another two examples. One is called, and it's quite a recent trend, neurofeminism. And as you can guess from the title or the concept, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, it's a kind of critique of neurosexism, which is visible in the idea of so-called sexed brain. It's quite a kind of 30 years old idea, starting from the sexed brain popular books, which were pointing out that there are differences between female and male brains in such a way that it results in certain cognitive styles characteristic for female and male, and furthermore in certain ways of behavior. So we could say that neurosexism is a kind of old way of sexist thinking, but put in more prestigious language, which is language of neuroscience. So neurofeminism is a kind of reaction against a very superficial way of reading the outcome of neuroscientific research. And again, as in the case of biology, we have here neuroscientists who are doing neuroscience themselves, and also at the same time they are critical thinkers, some of them philosopher of science as well, or sociologists of science. So as you can see from the slide, we have this critique of hardwiring model that which is saying that female and male brains are sexed or gendered like genitals. It's a critique of reductionist way of thinking about what's the essence of gender. It's a critique of giving too much space to genes or hormones while talking about gender. And it's a kind of critique of deterministic explanation via brain. So we are dealing here with something which is called cerebral subjectivity, so that everything in human being can be explained by the way the brain is working. In many of the books, like the one I'm presenting on the slide by Cordelia Fine, which I very enthusiastically recommend because this is the book which Cordelia Fine is psychologist, but she's working in the feminist, in the philosophy department. So she's very familiar also with philosophy of science, and she is pointing out in this book how misleadingly we can use scientific research in order to prove some stereotypes, in this case gender stereotypes, including the way we use experiments, the way we interpret the outcome of experiments, the way we use technology here, and so on and so forth, including also the way we understand notion of gender or notion of sex in the neuroscientific research. Of course, she's starting in this book from historical point of view, the idea that cognitive capacities of women are lower than of men, and so on and so forth. But this is very informative books, and I think the title is just pointing out that this feminist critique is not delivered in order to criticize science in general. It's not against science, so to speak, but it is very much in favor of science doing in a good and valid way. My second example is coming from the trend or current, which is called new feminist materialism, and two representative of them in manuals of this trend are Manuel de Landa or Rossi Braidotti, but I would like to concentrate on the other thinker, and she is Karen Barad, or they are Karen Barad, because she calls herself non-binary. And here again, we have example of a scholar who is a physicist, educated physicist and philosopher of science at the same time. And what she's trying to do is that, again, we should go beyond this dichotomy of nature and culture, the dichotomy which results in separation between humanities, social sciences, and science. And she is trying to combine these two approaches which are coming from philosophy and from quantum mechanics in order to present the new version of ontology, epistemology, and axiology, which she's not treated as separated spheres. In this case, we are rather dealing with something or with a trend who is kind of against language-focused approach, which we know from several so-called postmodern approaches to science. And she says in her work that too excessive power was granted to language to determine what is real, and that we should go back to matter itself. That's why it is called feminist materialism or new feminist materialism. And she is trying to explain that we can combine certain results coming from critical approaches and from scientific research, including giving more agency to the material substrate to treat the materiality or something we call the world or object as an active agent, that we should take into account that both material and cultural things matter from the very beginning in whatever we do in scientific research. So in the end, she's saying that what matters for the outcome or for what we would be called as scientific knowledge is not only something which is recognized within certain disciplines, but also power relations and the redistribution of power, which is recognized by society and culture, and which is very well diagnosed by humanities and social sciences. So again, she's trying to point out that we are on the way to gain better knowledge, in certain sense more objective knowledge, when we include critical approach of feminism, and not feminism only because Karen Barad is intersectional thinker, so gender is only one of critical dimension of what she's proposing. So the application of this feminist intervention can be done in many different ways, and these are my two last slides, and I just would like to present it to your attention that there is a certain trend, for example, in data studies, and data studies are very important from the experimental science point of view, because the way we collect, interpret, and present data is of huge importance in scientific research. And here again, there's a certain trend to point out that if we will take seriously such dimension as gender, which we know from feminist perspective and feminist interpretation, when we take it seriously, we can see how our certain views on gender are influencing the way we are presenting data, which means that we are not presenting it in ideally objective way. And this critical approach will allows us to, again, do science more properly. So these power relations can be seen also in the way we present data in particular disciplines, and the way we are interested in something, the way we treat embodiment or affectivity, why it is of less important than other stuff, and so on and so forth. And I'm just giving this example of this book because it's accessible online. It's within this open science idea, and can be approached by everyone who will be interested. How can we apply critical gender dimension to data science? And I will finish with the thinker I started with. This is the recent book. I think it was published in 2020 in collaboration with Londa Schiebinger. And this is the example how critical gender approach and introducing feminist intervention in certain domain can be helpful to do better work on this cognitive level. And so here again, we have intersectional approach. So not only gender is of valid, but both on this book accessible online and also on the website, which you have on the right-hand side. You can look how at certain domains, including biology, physics, urban studies, but also social studies, how particular concrete intervention of showing how gender can influence methodology, certain metaphors, outcomes, the interpretation of data can result both in biased science or less biased science, which would be the scope of aim of that book. And I think this is the example how feminist approach in philosophy of science and technology studies can be treated as a particular intervention which is aiming at certain visible results. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your comments. I will stop sharing because I would like to see you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aleksandra. I'm not sure. I think, Dietland, should I do the
Yes. Yeah.
right? Okay, great. Then yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. And of course, it did not or would not only have fitted to our workshop back in October, but also fits to our current discussions here in the colloquium. And so I'm pretty sure that we will have a lot of different questions. I don't know whether I can see everyone and whether there are already, yeah, there's already one raised hand by Dirk Schuck. And Dirk, please, you can start.
Great, I can start. Thank you so much. This was so interesting and such a wonderful presentation. And it's just coincident, but I was just reading a text. I was just reading a text on how in the 18th century, Sophie de Grouchy and Mary Wollstonecraft were criticizing Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. And I found this very interesting in the context of your talk, because because in the sentimentalist scheme, it's a bit the other way around, in the sense that for once men were talking a lot about situated knowledge, and Smith was always saying like, people always get their judgment. It's always about moral judgment, get their judgment from others. So it's always you have to see that they are in their specific context, and like kind of like they cannot really reach a certain level of objectivity. And actually, Grouchy and Wollstonecraft both say no. They say that's not true. We can distance ourselves from the social situation. We can reflect on it in a way in which we can somehow like look at our context from the outside and relativize itself. So it's like so that is something I had the idea that in the very last turn you made in this idea of the feminist materialism, there was something of that, this going back to science, in the sense that why does feminism has to have like the special perspective, in the sense why can't it have like the better idea of matter, in this sense, and the better approach to matter as like a core concept of science. So I was just wondering what you if you can maybe say something more about this, or what would be a feminist idea of matter in this context, for example. That would interest me a lot. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting what you found in the history. And I'll just start from that it shows how it is difficult to say that one kind of approach, let's say rational, is something which is masculine, and affectively or emotional is feminine. I mean, it is really misleading. And I think philosophically it's not valid at all. I would not say that I mean, of course, there's certain tradition of doing science, and scientists are trained how to do it. And it was different in different times. And science is something different now that it was in, I don't know, Middle Ages or in modern times. And it's true. And as I would say something like that in the context of feminist materialism. If you say that you should go back to agency of material or matter in English, it means that your knowledge about feminism is from, let's say, language-oriented trend. Because, I mean, it is very classical to say that feminist approach is within post-constructivism or postmodernism or something like that. And it's not dealing with science itself. From my perspective, as a philosopher of science, it's not the case. And also there's a cute discussion. Do we really have to go back to matter as feminists? Because we are far away, we are just talking about discourses and language and so on. It depends from which perspective you start. If you are biologists and feminists at the same time, you were close to matter for all that time, right? But if you ask what would be specific, that's how I understood your comment, what would be specific way of coming into matter from feminist perspective? And I think one of the idea is that, and it comes from the trend which is called feminist standpoint, that if, okay, we have this stereotype that female are closer to matter because of nature, because of their bodies, the role they play, and so on, the all experiences they have with reproduction, for example, that's why they're closer to something which is actively mattering, as Barad would say. So let's use it and take this perspective as more universal perspective, that it could be universal perspective for everyone. But of course, again, we are assuming a lot here. We are assuming that that stereotypes can be valid, that all females are connected with nature in such a way. And of course, it is culture specific. It is Western culture specific as well. A lot of wonderful philosophical questions here, but for sure, I think, and what is valid in that feminist materialism is to point out something which for me is kind of obvious, that feminism is not only about words and discourses and politics. It's also about cognition, about our experience with the word on many different levels, and it could be useful there. Okay, but yeah, very interesting point about this historical part. It's a pity I'm not historian myself, because it's a huge source for feminism as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question in the chat by Sheriban Imrak, who can turn on her microphone. I'll just read it out. The question is, first of all, what is the difference between positioned knowledge and situated knowledge? Second, can we really say that there is a neutral science, especially in the social sciences?
Not really sure about the first one. I use situated knowledge notion. So if you have a certain perspective where this positioned knowledge is used, I would be very interested in that. Situated knowledge is used by Donna Haraway as a, that's my interpretation, as a different way of reading objectivity. And she's pointing out that you are more objective when you are aware of your own position as a scientist, but also as a person with a certain experience, and also a person with certain aims. So in that sense, it's more objective than less. Yeah, I mean, of course, we are using words here, so it's always the kind of what kind of connotation we have. And if you say, what does it mean to be neutral? If we would say that to be neutral, it means that you are valueless, that your perspective is without values, I would say that it's not possible to do science without values. And it is including not only cognitive values, but also other values as well. And it's maybe easier for me to say that in such a way because I'm coming from science and technology studies. And in science and technology studies, we are not very much interested in the ideal of science. We are far more interested in the way science is done nowadays. So we are checking out how it is done. And if you look at it, at the practices of science, but also at certain science manifesto, you can show really easily that it's not neutral on axiological level. It's very involved in values. And also, historically speaking, it was never the case that neutrality would mean that there are no values in science other than truth or something like that. Even Galileo, when he was building his basis for modern science, he was saying that we should do science in order to gain certain aims. For example, well-being of humankind, and so on. And these are values. So I agree that I don't think that we can be neutral, and not only in social sciences, but in any other sciences. And the problem is that and this is what Haraway is saying, I guess. The problem is when you think that your own position is universal position. This is not scientific approach, that you should be aware of the fact that you are coming with certain aims and they are not neutral, and it's good that they are not neutral. This axiological part of doing science is especially important for feminist approach as I read it. I don't know if it's okay for you, Robyn, in that reply. So,
yeah, we would probably have to wait for something in the chat. We have 3 more questions right now by Dietland, Verena, and Antonia. Dietland is the first.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. I was very fascinated fascinated by your presentation, especially because you show us these different ways of feminist criticism in different disciplines, and the different topics this criticism picks up. For example, this the last example of feminist, the question of materialism and matter, or the idea of showing that the brain is gendered, and all this, the language, the metaphors, etc. And I think it is also the idea, this like Fox, Keller, and others who try to cross borders of scientific and not non-scientific thinking. And my question is whether all these things are something that in this cases feminist thinking is something like a synonym for criticism, and this is very convincing. But what I want to know, or what I would like to discuss, is whether it is how strongly the question of it is important that it is feminist criticism. It's a little bit provocative, but couldn't it be, for example, ethnic criticism, or scientific criticism, or whatever, all these thinking which are breaking boundaries between fields? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you. I will try to do it like this. First of all, what I like about the idea of criticism or critical thinking in, for example, Barad work, but it's also, I think, Haraway's approach, that she says that in general, in philosophy, but also in science studies, critical thinking was usually understood as being against something, or pointing out the errors of someone or someone's approach. Whereas Barad says that she would like to have such a knowledge where criticism means that I am co-thinking with you. We are thinking together with certain community, and I'm interested in your point, not to show that I'm right and you are wrong, but that I can change something on the way. So it's a kind of communitarian way of building science. And in that sense, a feminist approach is not critical approach, classically speaking. Barad says it's, and I think it's also in the background of all feminist discussions about identity politics, for example, about what does it mean to be a woman, what is femininity, what is subjectivity, and so on. And all these quarrels were like, you are right, I am wrong, and other way around. And she says it's not the point. Okay, so I would not see feminists as critical in very traditional sense, but you're right, and I think it's also Barad view that not in every case gender is the most important dimension. It depends. So and I think it is also something important for me. I cannot really say that every discipline and every particular theory is gendered biased or something like that. You have to check it out. You have to go through it and check it out and see if it maybe something else matters, like gender, like social class or narrative you are speaking, Western point of view, and so on. So it is more intersectional, and you are right that not in every case gender is of the most importance. And you are not stopping being feminist when you say, okay, but in this case it's gender neutral. It doesn't matter if that's the gender. Not to mention that in very contemporary ideas about where feminism should be. There are, for example, Rossi Braidotti is claiming that we will go beyond gender. because feminism itself is binary, is biased by binaries. It's talking about femininity and masculinity, and it's not saying non-binaries in that. So it is biased itself. So maybe we should go beyond thinking about gender itself. I wonder what kind of feminist it will be, but this is a certain strategy as well. So very right that it doesn't have to be gender at all. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The next question is by Verena Limburg. Verena.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. For me, it was a really instructive talk, as I'm not any kind of expert of feminist philosophies of science. And I would like to ask a question of interest, profiting from your expertise in the field. So my question is about the status of quantum mechanics, physics, and especially quantum mechanics in the field of feminist philosophies of science. You said yourself you're most interested in the discipline of biology, but maybe it's just the question, is there any philosophers, feminist philosophers of science dealing with quantum mechanics? As I understand it, quantum mechanics is in a way contradicting traditional scientific assumptions of matter and how matter behaves, and measurement plays a role. And there you have the intervention. Yeah, the measurement plays a role of how particles behave, at least on the level of single particles. So there, I just wondered if there's a structural analogy to some kind of feminist philosophies of science or epistemologies between quantum mechanics and feminist philosophies of science.
I would say that if we are to call Karen Barad philosopher of science, she's using certain ideas. For example, the relation between object and subject, as is it seen in quantum mechanics, or you could also call it observer and the observed object. And she is trying to put it more generally in thinking about relation between subject and object in the world, so that they intervene with each other, that they always dynamic, that there is a certain influence of observer onto the object which is observed. So you cannot really keep the separation between object and subject as it used to be in philosophy in general. So that would be one of the examples how we can use this quantum mechanics concepts, because it's not, I think it can be taken only in metaphorical way. And what Barad is doing, she is starting from Niels Bohr and his way of seeing stuff, because he was very philosophical in his claims how we can, if we are presenting certain interpretation of quantum mechanics, how it will result in our more general view of the world, and how it will change the way we think about ourselves and our relation to the world. And that's what she's starting to doing. I cannot give you any other examples of contemporary philosophers of science who are dealing with quantum mechanics itself, because as you said, I'm more in biology. But Karen Barad is within the group of people who are both working in quantum mechanics and doing philosophical thinking. And I think all of her concepts, like interaction, like going beyond this division of labor in philosophy, like ontologists, epistemologists, axiologists. And she said we should treat it as one total whole because it is interrelated. They're all coming from quantum mechanics, but she's proposing how to apply it in philosophical thinking. And I find it really fascinating because quantum mechanics is so counterintuitive, like from ordinary experience point of view, that I really like the idea. They quite controversial, but I think I don't know, they inspiring, I would say. But I'm not a specialist in quantum mechanics. I'm just fascinated by it. But I would say that there are Also, Evelyn Fox Keller, she's also speaking about the influence of physics on contemporary biological narratives. It means certain concepts or way of understanding them is taken from physics, because historically speaking, physics was really influential on biology. From our point of view, I mean, historian of science, you could look at 20th century as a success of biological studies, but they are successful also because they taken certain ways of thinking from physics. I'm not sure if only quantum mechanics, but from physics certainly. So if you ask if there are people who are using this concept of quantum mechanics in philosophy of science, yes, they certainly are.
Okay, thank you. The next question is by Antonia Pog. Antonia.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for your talk. So in Erfurt, we also have a research group on the praxeologies of truth, and I thought that your talk really fit in well with things that we talk in those contexts. So I want to ask a truth question, if I may. And I was really interested in your points on primatology and feminism, and I was wondering about truth concepts in that context. So would it be correct to say that the assumptions that these scholars dealt with or were confronted with was that anything situated, so speaking from an unmarked position, would be politicized and cannot be objective, and in that sense would not be able to work towards scientific truth or however. So that's kind of what I took from your talk and where I started. And then I was wondering, because it's been a little while since I read Donna Haraway, would she not provide a counter argument when you say that when she argues that you're more objective when you are aware of your situated subject position? So does that make sense? Or if I rephrase that in a really, really broad context, could you say a few words about the interest of feminist philosophy in truth concepts in a way? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's a difficult question from the perspective of science and technology scholar, not from philosophical point of view, because truth obviously is difficult. It's a crucial topic also for philosophy of science. So I would say the following: if we keep truth as a value of aim of what we do in science, okay, so kind of theological value, it is still there. And I would understand Haraway in such a way that she refuses to skip the objectivity for that very reason. Because if feminism will be only about situateness, it will look like it is not interested in cognitive thing. It's not interested in how the world works. And she says the opposite. We see that we can be biased, that we are situated, that we are starting from certain position, but at the same time, we want to gain some knowledge, true knowledge about what we are studying. So I would say that in feminism, it is about the true, about the world, but I would not understand it as in classical conceptions of truth. And what I think, especially in science and technology studies tradition, is important is certain way Polish microbiologist and philosopher Ludwig Fleck was saying that truth is not or should not be seen within the relation between object and subject, but also as a triangle, object, subject, and community, in which you are stating certain ideas. And he was calling it a certain way of thinking. So it is in that sense, always situated. But I think your intuition is right, that truth as such is not the most important topic of feminist philosophy of science. More important topics are how these biases are constructed, how can we go beyond them, how certain power relations can influence your epistemic position. But on the other hand, I would not say that feminist thinkers are not interested in how the world is, but maybe they understand world as very various, as very dynamic, as difficult to catch in one snapshot. I'm sure it is not satisfactory, but what I would like to say is that the feminists I admire and I'm interested in, and I hope to be representative of, is feminists who is also interested in cognitive values, not only in non-cognitive values, but also in this cognitive dimension. And that's how I read Haraway as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have 2 more questions so far. The next one is by Alexei Lochmatov. Alexei.
Yeah, thank you very much for your great work. I would like to follow up Dietlin's question to some extent, please, and to ask you about the relations between this feminist materialism or new feminist materialism and capitalism and the critique of capitalism, because I used to think feminism as a part of the left-wing discourse, not exclusively, but as a social criticism, which has to do with among other things, with the critics of capitalism. But all these categories, which you mentioned in your talk, in the end of your talk, generated innovations. I mean, this idea, gendered innovations, how analysis contribute to research innovation, and so on. It's I see it as a very capitalist categories. I mean, it is an attempt how we can sail us as female scientists. So probably just a brief remark on this.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's a very good point. I would say that in the same line like that, many females are adherents of patriarchy, and they keep the patriarchy going. It's the lot of feminist trend which situate themselves very well within the system of capitalistic or consumeristic or I don't know, how to call it, contemporary science. So you have a lot of trends in feminism, and I would not say that all of them or majority of them is against capitalist system. The lot which are, and they are coming from the tradition of socialist thinking in feminism, but the basis of Anglo-Saxon feminists are coming from liberal feminism, which is very much connected with the way the capital works. And of course, maybe not of course, but there are certain representatives who are also dealing very deeply with these capital dynamics of contemporary science. For example, Isabel Stengers, one of the co-workers with Bruno Latour. She's, for example, recently I was reading it with my students. It was very interesting. She's calling for slow science to change the system in a whole, because science became a part of capitalist system, producing certain things in order to be sold, and so on and so forth, with all its nuanced way. So there are some feminists who see it and who are very critical of the system, but of course, if they are scientists themselves, they are working within the system. Okay, it's a different probably story. Can we be critical about the system, whereas we are part of it, and we have to really do as the system tells us to do. For example, to proliferate your publications and so on and so forth, right? But I would answer very trivially and maybe not satisfactorily. There are a lot of different trends in feminism. But if you rightly so pointing out that philosophers of science, contemporary philosophers of science, they're trying to point out that we can include certain gender dimension in order to do more innovative science, which is of course part of the same story. I agree. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is by Michael Katzek. Michael.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting to me. And I thought it was very interesting that you pointed out the recent interventions in feminist science studies in the field of neuroscience and also data science in kind of the we could say maybe like tradition, as Haraway intervened in the primatologist biologies. And you mentioned the reactions of primatologist researchers to these feminist interventions, and as they were rather criticizing or trying to disassociate from feminist ideas. And I wanted to ask you about what you think, how what chance do these theoretical potentials that feminist theory can contribute to these science fields, what chance is there that these potentials can be actualized? I mean, we can talk about, you pointed out these theoretical potentials so clearly, but I mean, in the light of recent or today's growing anti-gender discourses in public, I mean, they do influence scientific communities as well, I guess, and especially more traditional scientific communities. In that light, what would you think? Like, what potential is there to actualize these theoretical contributions?
Yeah, I think your intuition is right, that it is still the case that it's very difficult to say that you are, for example, feminist biologist, because it is still separated, that we, on the one hand, have certain point of views which are kind of personal or political, and on the other hand, we are doing science in magic way, separating ourselves from those points of view. For me, for example, as a philosopher, it's still very difficult in a sense that I'm not treated seriously when I say that I'm a feminist in philosophy. It's far more easier in science and technology studies. So you can see why I jumped into science and technology studies, because there I can speak about it openly and show my own situatedness. And I say I'm a feminist, so I'm a kind of sensitive to gender issues. I'm not saying it's the whole you all should be interested in, but I'm showing you openly that that's what interests me. When I look at the practices of science, I would say, and this is very common in the tradition of science and technology studies, that the best interventions are institutional or systematic interventions, not personal, not individual. The changes which we can gain are coming from the system. And what Alexei was saying is working against feminism. I think that the dynamic of capitalism is feeding itself by stereotypes, not only gender stereotypes, but race stereotypes and so on, and social class stereotypes, for example. But in many cases, on institutional level, political force can change the dynamic of scientific studies. For example, if you look at very concrete illustration coming from gender equality plans, which all institutions, European institutions, have to have if they want to apply for any grants or scholarships within European research area. So even in Poland, at today's time of the regime we have as a government, we were forced to do it because chemists, physicists, biologists could not apply for Horizon or whatever grant if we didn't have it. So there are a lot of physicists and biologists I'm speaking with at my university who are very much against feminist values, but they see that they have to do it in order to have it. So that will change a lot because there are certain criteria which you have to follow in order to really adopt this gender equality plan. So it is for me as a philosopher, this personal individual level is really important. But when I look at changes, I think they have to come from the institution, from the system, because they are more powerful. It's easier to put them there. If we were waiting for changing people's view, there are some studies who show that there will be equality on the institutional level as to a position, for example, at the universities in 300 years. So it's still the case that, at least in Poland, but I think it's the same in your countries, 75% of full professorships are male in Poland. Whereas on PhD level, we have equality. We have 50-50, but still the case that higher up, we don't have these female professorships. So if we were just waiting for people to let it change, it will not change very quickly. So I was giving these examples of primatologists because it was kind of very rare, I think, courage of certain primatologist scientists saying that she has to cope with such a case, that she has certain beliefs, but she cannot really say about them openly within the scientific institution, because then she will be treated less seriously. It was very personally difficult for her. And such stories are also kind of feminist side of doing philosophy of science, narratives, storytelling, saying about your own experience as a scientist. How does it change the way you work? And she said that being feminist on the one side and taking part on all these movements and in the United States, and at the same time do not incorporating it directly into her studies, was really kind of schizophrenic, and it was difficult for her to be scientist in such a way. So, and I'm not saying that it's the same for me as a philosopher, but when I say that I do feminist philosophy, people say, okay, you can do it with other females in your own rooms. It's not the mainstream of philosophy we are not interested in. So it's still the case. And I think maybe I will finish with such a statement. The older the discipline, the more traditional as to gender dimension. So it is easier in biology, for example, nowadays, or biochemistry. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's still a few minutes left. I can pose another question which directly relates to what Maike just asked. That would be, and you already taught us a little bit about that. In the history of science, the history in the science studies sense of the word of philosophy, specifically of analytical philosophy, has not really been tackled yet. And of course, this is a vast field that could be studied if in a new way, if we take into account the specific practices, the values, the epistemological structure, and so on of analytical philosophy. And now the interesting thing, and you just more or less answered to that, is that at least concerning Germany, analytical philosophy is dominant and is seen as the number one current in philosophy that is able in two ways to somehow cite scientific work. That is, on the one hand, analytical philosophers are the only ones that really truly understand the complexity of science because they adhere to the same values. And on the other hand, if you need someone to give you hints on how to behave, you always have, the ethics department in philosophy as well. And so in discussions, this also applies to our own university, about how to restructure departments and stuff. These are always, the two fields where people think that they need philosophers. Feminist philosophy does nearly not appear, maybe in the context that you just mentioned, that someone has to deal with the gender equality issues. So my question would be, if you could maybe very briefly say something about this, is there any kind of compatibility between analytical philosophy and a real feminist philosophy, or is analytical philosophy simply the last, somehow, the last resort of these kind of very old God's viewpoint objectivity that Harry already criticized in the 80s?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point as well. And first, what's coming to my mind is that a lot of feminist thinkers in philosophy who are dealing with the tradition which could be called analytic. For example, there are feminist interpretation of Quine philosophy, or of objectivity, but understood in very traditional empirical way, for example. And what they say there is that they refuse to be narrowed only to tradition, which is kind of postmodern or language oriented, or I don't know, coming after Nietzsche, or so-called continental philosophy. So a lot of thinkers who are trying to sustain within the tradition also of analytical way of doing philosophy. And of course, we can discuss it for a long time. What does it mean, analytic? Because analytical can mean also the way you do philosophy. So, for example, that you are very careful about defining concepts, that you are going through very comprehensive, concise way of reasoning. We could also call it analytical. And a lot of feminist philosophers who are in that line, and it's important for them. For example, maybe you know the logician Susan Hack, and she says, I'm a feminist as well. But I'm feminist because I'm of equality. And I think that equality is an important matter in philosophy as well. But I do my philosophy using this traditional stuff and so on. So I would say, of course, this is not maybe direct or first thought when you think about feminism, that you would also think about analytic philosophy. But there are examples where they are not in quarrel and they deal well. But the second thing would be, and maybe I will pose the question back, do you think that the domination, because I understood that that how you put it, that in Germany, the dominant philosophy is analytical philosophy. Is it the case? Or
I think it still is, yeah.
Yeah. And I think it deals more, at least in Poland, with the view that if you are doing, let's say, logic-oriented philosophy, or let's keep it like this: logic-oriented philosophy, you are more scientific. You're more within the group with real scientists. And when you are doing this feminist stuff, you're more like, I don't know, artist. You're writing stories and metaphors, and that's something like that. And I wonder, because in the whole discussion about the collapse of capitalism, in the sense that we are facing the collapse of our environment and global warming case, that we really need new stories and metaphors and not analytical philosophy. And I think it really plainly deals with power. If you are writing your papers within analytic tradition, they are valued higher, and they seen within the scope of scientific research as more important. You are more scientific in very traditional sense of Vienna Circle, I would say. So in that sense, it's a very traditional way of doing philosophy. And of course, feminist way is not traditional in that sense, but it can be analytic, dealing with tradition of philosophy and also using certain way of writing. And of course, Haraway is not a good example, and Barad is also not good example. But for example, Evelyn Fox Keller, she's very analytic in the way she writes, and a lot of such thinkers, and I really admire them. My own history is that I'm coming from analytic philosophy. My PhD was about Wittgenstein, and and there are feminist interpretation of Wittgenstein as well. So for me personally, analytic philosophy is not interesting anymore because it is not about the world I live in. And I think, as you said, I'm a chair of practical philosophy in Aristotelian sense. And I value history of philosophy very much and historians, but as long as I can understand something because of their work, of my world. And I mean, I'm not in a place to say how you should do philosophy, but I'm not interested very much in analytic philosophy anymore, as long as they will keep me at the university. I can do my feminist stuff. But it's a good question. Can we transform or deconstruct analytic philosophy in such a way that it will become interested in feminist issues? Because it's also the priority of concepts and problems they choose to write about. And of course, within the ethics, you're right, there are a lot of feminists there as well. But the whole tradition I read from epistemology, for example, they all somehow related to analytic philosophy. And what I've learned from my being at Trinity College was also that these English-speaking people, they also work within the tradition of also analytic philosophy. Not all of them, but some of them as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Aleksandra, for your very interesting talk. Thank you to everyone for all the very interesting questions. And we are now a little bit over time, so we have to finish right away. Maybe just let me give you a very short hint that next week we will be either in Gotha or online again with a talk about the literary remains of Leni Riefenstahl. But for now, thank you very much to our speaker. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you so much. You were a wonderful audience, and I almost felt like we see each other. So it's a pity we cannot go for a beer now or wine or something. So
yeah, it really is. Yeah, but
yeah,
there will be some time.
Yeah. I hope our ways will cross again. Thank you so much for the invitation, for doing this, and for listening to me. And I wrote down all the questions. I will think about them as well for the future references. Thank you, Alexi, for your help.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Everyone.
Goodbye.
Have a nice evening. See you next week. Goodbye.